Okay, good morning. My name's Danny Burns and I work at the Institute of Development Studies as a professor there, and I direct the CLARISSA program, which is focusing on worst forms of child labour. And I have two colleagues here with me from Bangladesh. Perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself. Jiniya, do you want to say who you are?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Jiniya Afroze. I'm working as country coordinator for CLARISSA in Bangladesh, based at Maksud.
Hello, everybody. This is A.K.M. Maksud. I work with Gram Bangla Unnayan Committee as the executive director, and I am working as a technical advisor with CLARISSA, Child Labor Action Research Innovation in South and Southeastern Asia program headed by Professor Danny Burns.
So thank you, Maksud. So we're going to spend a little bit of time clearly in the context of the year for the elimination of child labour, talking about the CLARISSA program, what we're focusing on, why we're focusing on those things, and so on. You know, very much aware of, for example, in the background, a lot of work going on by international agencies like the ILO, the International Labour Organization, who have called for the end of child labour in just the next few years. From our perspective, we think that's a very important call. We think that work's going to hopefully have an influence on governments across the world, but we're also witnessing quite a heavy kickback to worst forms of child labour and child labour more generally as a result of the COVID pandemic and other factors. And we're not convinced it's realistic to think about the end of child labour within the next few years. What we do think is realistic is to focus very tightly on the worst forms of child labour. And of course, there's all sorts of definitions of the worst forms of child labour, but essentially we're talking about work which is hazardous, can be harmful to children. We're talking about children who are working 12 to 16 hours. We're talking about children carrying heavy loads, or you work in water. There are many manifestations of that, working with cutting machines, facing the risk of accidents and so on. And I think we can use our common sense to know what we mean by worst forms of child labour. So we think that it's really important now for a concerted effort to focus on the elimination of the worst forms of child labour as the first step. The other thing that we think is important is that we focus on the drivers, because a lot of the work that happens around child labour could be considered within the umbrella of what's called rescue, or helping people to find pathways out of child labour. The problem with that is that for every child that finds their way out, if the system is set up to pull children in, there'll be new children that come in. So we're interested in how do you find ways to break that cycle, to shift the system dynamics, not just focus on the individual child and whether that particular child can get out of worst forms of child labour. And the third thing that we're very focused on is the domestic markets and the informal sector. What's very clear from our work already is that most of the worst forms of child labour in urban areas, which is very much the focus of our CLARISSA program, are in the informal sector. They're in small family businesses, in units where maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 or 10 people work. They're not in huge factories. And that means that it's harder to find an entry point, because you're talking with multiple different organizations, but it also means that it's really important to do that. So while a lot of the big work is going on with governments and big corporations and brands, that's actually leaving much of the worst forms of child labor completely untouched. But if you like, that's the sort of the foundation starting point for our program. I don't know, Jiniya or Maksud, if you want to add anything about sort of things that you think are sort of key foundational building blocks for our program.
No, Danny, you have I mean, very rightfully presented the overview. Yes, I mean, in our work, we're trying to understand the lives of children and the people who are living within the community so that we get a better sense of the drivers that push children into child labor, but mostly in the worst form of child labor, and try to understand what do they think as can be a way out of it in a system, and the focus is more on the as you say that shifting the system dynamics, which is I think very unique for us in CLARISSA.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you use that phrase, what do they think? And I think that's quite key to our whole approach, which is like starting with the children and their perceptions. I know, Maksud, that you've spent quite a lot of time on the ground with the children in some locations within Dhaka particularly. I mean, have you got any thoughts about, how we're framing this work as being very child-centered and child-oriented?
Danny, we are working with CLARISSA since November 2018, and we had lots of conversation with the children, with their family, and we have now evidence that why children are coming and joining with the worst form of child labor situation in Bangladesh, especially Dhaka city. And the thing is, the rural poverty and overburdened, debt situation of the families because of, heavy burden of microcredit, and climate change effect is heavily imposing on the poor people because they're poor. But when there is a cyclone, when there is a big flood, then they are, pressure, increases on them, and finding no other way in the rural setting, they be, compelled to migrate in the urban slums. And coming to the urban slums, all the family members, father, mother, children, brother, sister, everybody try to earn something, and especially in the informal setting, with the small shops, with the small factory workshops, and these are very low paid job. So this way they get involved with the work situation, and they get heavily exploited in this sector.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and it raises issues about, I mean, a big focus of what we're looking at is resilience, and also resilience to shocks, because clearly a lot of what we're finding is that in response to shocks, as you said, families migrate, but also almost always they take on high interest loans. So the children have to work not only just to meet the demands of day-to-day poverty, but also to help the families pay off the loans that they've taken in response to that poverty. And so you get that vicious cycle. And that's why we need to break these cycles. So I think that, a lot of this is the framing for this work. I mean, it probably is worth saying, just for the audience, just to clarify, that CLARISSA stands for Child Labour Action, Research, Innovation in South and Southeast Asia. The program was originally focused on 3 countries, which is Bangladesh, Nepal, and Myanmar, but unfortunately it's been impossible to continue with the work in Myanmar as a result of the coup. So worth saying that, and also it's being held together by a consortium which comprises Institute of Development Studies, the A.K.M, Child Hope, and Consortium for Street Children. So organizations that are long experienced in working with children on the ground, and alongside TDH in Bangladesh, Gram Bangla, which is Maksud's organization, who've been working in the slums of Dhaka for many, many years, are central to our Bangladesh partnership. So we talked a bit about like innovation, which is generated by children. And we also talked a bit about evidence, which is generated by children. So, I mean, it's probably worth noting that in a way, this is a bit of an unusual program. It's about innovation. It's about evidence, and it's about scaling. So it's not a direct delivery program. It's trying to figure out whether if you really devolve power to children, to local stakeholders, to explore the issues in some detail, do they generate new ways of thinking about the issues, new ways of unlocking problems and issues, new ways of thinking about how to shift the system? And I guess that's what we're trying to do at some scale. So we will have 18 participatory action research processes running. We will have children's research groups and children's advocacy groups. We also have in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, a social protection pilot, which is exploring both how to build resilience through unconditional cash transfers, but also how, if you layer onto that in-depth, intensive community support, casework support, you know, can that build the foundations for shifting those neighborhoods in such a way that they're not dependent on worse forms of child labor? Probably worth noting that this is you'll have gathered from what we said already that this is a very strongly urban focused program. So we're looking at urban dynamics. And in CLARISSA, specifically in Bangladesh, we're looking at the leather supply chain. And the reason why we've looked at leather is because, you know, next to the ready-made garment sector, it's one of the largest sectors, and it's incredibly unregulated in relationship to worse forms of child labor compared to the ready-made garment sector. I mean, clearly there's a lot of child labor in that sector also, but this is really extreme in some contexts. So that's why we're looking at leather. So I think that maybe says something about our program. I don't know, Maksud, Jiniya, if you want to add anything about the sort of the core elements of the program before we start to get into the details of what we're doing.
I think it's fine.
Okay, so what we're starting with is a process of understanding what's going on through the voices of the children themselves, and we've adapted a methodology which I and other colleagues had used in other contexts, in some conflict and peace building contexts, in some work on modern slavery, where peers collect life stories from their peers. So children collect life stories of children, facilitators collect life stories of children. Those life stories are then analyzed by the children. Jiniya, maybe you could tell us something about that process and, you know, exactly what we've been doing.
Sure. Thank you, Danny. Yes, I mean, that is one of the exciting task in CLARISSA. We are engaged, I mean, children who are engaged in hazardous and exploitative work were invited in our program by our researchers to share their stories. As Danny, you mentioned that in CLARISSA, we have adopted child-centeredness, and we believe that children are the experts of their lives, and they know their lives more than anyone else. So we invited 400 children to share their stories about their life in general, but also what led them to do the work that they're doing, their work condition, etc. So these stories will be analyzed by children themselves, and in a participatory analysis process, we will generate evidence And this will help us to see the connections, I mean, what led to what, and this will help us to see the cause and consequences of children's lives. And we haven't done the analysis yet. I mean, it's an exciting moment for us because we're taking preparation for large scale narrative analysis workshop that is planning to happen very soon, where we will work with a number of children so that they can engage themselves in the participatory analysis process. So, as Jani, you mentioned that a number of the children who told their stories are also were trained to work as facilitators with CLARISSA facilitators. So some of the children will also collect stories from their peers, and we hope that it will probably add altogether a different perspective in the way peers share stories with their peers. So yeah, this is one exciting thing in our work. And I mean, as we haven't done the analysis, so I'm not going to go into detail because we don't have that detailed information as yet. But I mean, while talking to the children, I mean, we come to know, as Danny, you also mentioned earlier, that the work that children are doing, in most of the cases, they work in difficult condition and they work in situation which is harmful for their health and mental well-being. And we have had mapping of children's engagement in worst form of child labor, particularly in the leather supply chain, which Maksud Bhai will talk about in a few minutes. But talking to the children, we know that they start working really early as 7, 8 years old. So if we walk through the lanes within the slum neighborhood, we'll easily find a few children hammering nails. They are drying leather under direct sunlight. They work for 10, 12 hours a day for 6 days a week for maybe about 30, 40 pounds a month. And they use chemicals with their hand, I mean, which has long-term consequence for their health as well as their well-being. And in many cases, children told us that they experience physical and emotional abuse. So one of the child, I would quote what the child said, and one of the boys who said that, I mean, when I grow up, I want to have a factory of my own, so that the children who will be working or the people who will be working with me will not experience any abuse. So this is what the children aspire to be, to have a workplace which is not harmful or which is safe, because children work and it's not an option for many, because most of the children, they must work because the income they have ensure that they have food in the family. Their income helps their family to pay the medical bills, as you also said, that pay off their debts. In some of the cases, to pay tuition fees for the younger siblings. So it's not an option. It's where they are they're bound to do that. So really, children need to work in many cases, but we understand that they need to work in a place which is safe and comfortable for them. So yeah, we understand that, I mean, COVID-19 has added further vulnerability to the children. And from our experience while talking to the children, we know that, I mean, the situation has made their life even more difficult in many cases. And in this case, as you say, that the social protection pilot that we are aiming to have, it has two focus. One is relational work that will be delivered or supported by our community mobilizers. Well, they will try to understand the need from the community and try to support the children and families to identify solutions for the problems. But it will also have direct cash support, universal cash, unconditional cash support to a particular community where we will be working. So that's also very exciting for us, and we're looking forward to see that what the research findings tell us. And I think that, I mean, from our work in the community in the past few months with the pandemic situation, we understand that it's really difficult, and And I think I will let Maksud bhai to share some of the key findings or experience of working with children in relation to the mapping that you have done in the leather supply chain, because that's a beautiful study which gives us much detail into the reality of children's lives.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be good. And one of the things I wanted to say, just to quickly add to what you just said there, Jiniya, is that the children we're working with are not the privileged children. So what maybe we should emphasize this more, but this is a very large-scale participatory program, and perhaps one of the biggest participatory programs that FCDO in the UK has ever funded. And the idea is that we engage children who are illiterate, children who are living in the slums, children who are working in the worst conditions, with the assumption that they can both deliver for themselves very, very high quality analysis and analyze their own situation, and also that they're capable of assessing their own risks and generating their own action. And so the whole program is founded on that idea that participation has to be at the core of any solution. But Maksud, yes, tell us a bit more about what we found in the leather supply chain, and maybe tell us a little bit about where we've concentrated our work and why.
Yes, thank you, Danny. As you said before that we have focused on the leather sector to work and to explore the situation of the worst form of child labor in the sector. And to know this, this CLARISSA program used methods of the scientific social researchers to collect information and analyze the whole supply chain of the leather industry. And as we documented 107 processes of the supply chain of the leather industry, we could identify worst form of child labor with 103 processes. That is 96% of the processes involved with the supply chain of the leather industry is contaminated, is involved with worst form of child labor. So our exploratory research found that from cattle rearing, slaughtering, flaying, to washing, dehairing, liming. These are the process, and some kind of technical terms, and to tanning and dyeing, drying and making crushed leather, making finished leather, and from this leather, lots of products lines are getting produced. For example, footwear is a big industry here in Bangladesh, and bag making, leather jacket making, money bag, belt. These are the products. With all the products,
I think we're losing Maksud there on the internet.
Leather with the cow dung, with the hair, lots of processes also are there, and children are also found in, for example, glue making, or making, brush for painting wall, etc. So now, as Jiniya said, that our task is to help children, facilitate children to find their own ways to eliminate worst form of child labor from our society. That is one of the great cards for the society. So we'll be working with the children, as Dennis said, that with the participatory action research processes, to be with the children so that they can innovate their own ways of elimination of the worst form of child labor.
I think as you've raised some important points here, Maksud, because I think, on the one hand, we've got, a government that seems to be interested in creating change, has described leather as one of the sectors it wants to clean up, and clearly has brought some regulation into the formal parts of the leather supply chain. But on the other hand, as soon as you look into the informal parts of the supply chain, we see, as you said, 103 out of 107 processes involved worse forms of child labor. And some of that's really extreme work with chemicals. Some of it can be processes which seem quite innocent, but a child's working 16 hours a day. And that's what we really, really need to focus on, is how do you shift that? And the difficulty, of course, is that we need to shift that across multiple businesses. One of the things that's probably worth saying is that, you know, our interest is to really follow and understand the linkages in these supply chains and what the drivers are. Because on the one hand, as Jiniya, you said earlier, you know, the children are in that situation because the parents and their wider families have to borrow money and they just simply have no money. Or if COVID strikes, then there's no work, the children have to work. On the other hand, we're beginning to discover from our thematic research and some of our reviews of the literature that the supply chain itself is structured to need child labor. So if you think about a very long supply chain, and in this case, we've identified 107 processes, then essentially risk is pushed down from the bigger producers of the project all the way down into the informal sectors. And the further you go down, the more precarious life is for the small businesses. So the small businesses also have to borrow high interest loans. And that means they've got debts to pay back, which means they have to cut their costs down to a minimum. And they then employ children in these tasks and so on. So we're looking at this from both directions. You know, what are the things that push children into child labor, but also what are the things that pull children into child labor as a result of the demands of the supply chains and the way the supply chains are structured. So supply chains is one focus, but also neighborhoods. And we've chosen, in this case, in Bangladesh, neighborhoods that have got leather work at their heart. But we're also looking at all of the other pathways that children take within a neighborhood so that we can understand how the neighborhood dynamics also structure worse forms of child labor. So that some children, you know, some of the children might be going into leather work where their siblings might be going into domestic labor, or construction work or other types of work within those neighborhoods. So we're trying to understand how all of that happens. And we also have a whole set of questions, for example, around the relationship between the formal and the informal sectors. I think our starting premise in many respects is that very, very little is known about the dynamics of worse forms of child labor in the informal sector. I don't know, Jiniya or Maksud, if you want to add anything to our sort of the sort of the key things that we're really trying to understand or look at.
Here, Danny, the key thing is in Bangladesh, there are some good parliamentary act, especially the Child Act, the Labor Act. These are good acts to combat worst form of child labor. But again, you know, still in Bangladesh, there is no parliamentary act that deal the informal sector, though 87% of the labor force is involved with the informal sector. And again, in the urban setting, you know, in the neighborhood, in the leather supply chain, you know, lots of child labor and informal sector labors are there. So here is a very weak area where CLARISSA can contribute, you know. And we have, again, very little information regarding the extent and nature of the, you know, very informal economic institutions. Those are unregistered, and the Directorate of Inspection for Industries and Inspection under Labor Ministry, they do not come to visit them, and they do not come to see what is happening here. So under the legal framework of this country, the legal frame and the state institutions have, limitations, very big limitations to deal this informal sector and worst form of child labor. And currently in Bangladesh, we find no child labor elimination program implemented by the government. The government program has been stuck for last 3 years, though they have planned to implement a program that have ability to withdraw 100,000 worst form of child labor from their work, but it is stagnant for 3 years. So this is the situation here.
Yeah. And I mean, I recall seeing a figure fairly recently, which said, it might have been in one of our scoping reports, which said that there are something like one inspector for every 10,000 businesses in Bangladesh, or whatever the number is. It's clearly completely disproportionate to the problem. And that would suggest that actually we need to increase regulation within the sector. The problem is that you can't regulate businesses that are unregistered or that don't officially exist. So regulation in that sense, or enforcement as they describe it, is not really a meaningful solution in the informal sector. So then you resort to the sort of the general high-level law, but there are well-known problems within the informal sector anyway. Lots of it's invisible, as we've talked about before, as there's sort of hidden parts of what are the formal sector, which are also in the informal sector. It's a very complex and very unknown space, and very hard for government to engage with, which is why we need to think about how we engage with businesses, and small businesses in particular, in a different sort of way. Which maybe leads me on to talking a little bit more again about our methods. As I said, the heart of the program is about participatory process, and we use a form of participatory action research, systemic action research, we call it, because it's about creating systemic change in order to be able to generate innovations. So, for example, we talked earlier about the life stories. 400 life stories are a fabulous resource, for the participants, for us, for the world, but on their own, they're just some interesting, illuminating narratives. The way we want to work is to use those narratives, as Jiniya said, to generate a collective analysis where the children understand the pathways, they understand the causalities and so on. And then they use that to generate the sets of issues and causal relationships they want to work with in groups. And we call those action research groups. And those groups will meet maybe 18 times or 20 times in a year. And they will gather their own evidence around the specific issue that they're trying to resolve. They'll draw in other stakeholders when they need to. They'll work with us to bring in the resources and make the links to policymakers and others if they need to. And they'll start to generate solutions. Now, the issues that they raise could be extremely wide-ranging, and I'm not going to preempt them, but they could be anything from how do I improve the working conditions in this factory unit, to how do we create a worst form of child labor free zone in this neighborhood, or anything else. The point is that they generate the issues. So our focus is on action. It's using evidence to generate innovation, which is then turned into action, and then we learn from that. And this is important because one of the things we've built into the program is a very, very detailed and comprehensive evaluation process, which runs and has run all the way in parallel. Because this is one of the few very large-scale participatory processes, and because very few of the good, high-quality participatory processes have had really good evaluation alongside them, we thought this was a priority. We really want to understand how when you open up spaces for people to take their own power, what sort of innovation that generates and why it generates that sort of innovation. So, I mean, I think this probably gives a flavor of what the CLARISSA program is all about. Maksud, Jiniya, do you want to offer any last reflections on what we're doing? There will be follow-up conversations to this podcast, so people who are interested will be able to get a lot more detail. But any last thoughts? Maksud first.
Thank you, Danny. My last few words will be in relation to COVID-19 coronavirus situation and difficulties in the life of the children involved in worst form of child labor. The thing is, the situation worsened. That is my word, and our learning, the CLARISSA learning, will capture those situations and integrate this a new dimension with worst form of child labor. And I believe that we'll be able to explore collectively situations, informations that will help the children with their learning also, and with their innovative tactics in combating worst form of child labor.
Jiniya.
Yeah, I mean, in line with what Maksud Bhai said, that I think in CLARISSA we are in a unique position to really generate some evidence from by working with children and communities through Children's Research Group, Life Stories, Action Research Group, Thematic Research, Social Protection Pilot, and I mean, I'm really looking forward to working in this program and collectively identify the next steps with the community members.
Thank you, Jiniya. And I think what both of you said has also reminded me that we said, core elements of this program are that it's child-centered and that it's participatory. A third key element is that it's highly adaptive. So you talked about, the COVID situation. We've had to completely change our methods, do lots of online work, make sure that children are socially distanced, that we're socially distanced, and so on, and had to completely rethink how we're doing our work. And of course, the whole of the COVID situation has resulted in collapsed supply chains and has actually literally changed the whole world that we're working in. So if we had a fixed program plan, we would have already been sunk. Similarly in the wider program, obviously, the Myanmar coup happened. We can have natural disasters, and also just in the everyday of our learning, we start an action research group and it starts to discover things. Then actually we need to be able to adapt the program to be able to work on the things that are emerging, that are exciting and important, that we didn't know about when we started. So in that sense, we'd like to highlight the importance here of building large programs, but with a very adaptive flavor, so that you can move, shift resources, put things into the spaces that they need to be in, which you could never have anticipated before you started the process. And we've already learned so much that we didn't know at the start. And we're only a few years into this program. So on that note, I think I wanted to end by saying you can find out more by looking at the CLARISSA website, which is clarissa.global. We're also just about to set up a new Twitter account, which is @ChildLabourAction, for any of those of you that are sort of experts in the Twitter world and following the Twitter feeds. Other than that, if you're interested, then please feel free to email us, contact us in any of the normal ways, and we will continue to build this work, as I say, in Bangladesh and Nepal now, and keep you up to date with how it's all going. So thank you all. Thank you, Jiniya, and thank you, Maksud.